Hello, and welcome to Grief Seeds, a podcast where you'll find insights, reframings, metaphors, and visualizations, all known as grief seeds, to help you cultivate growth and healing in your life after loss. My name is Shelby Forsythia. I'm an intuitive grief guide and author, and on this show, I'll share insights from my interactions with clients, wise words from fellow grievers, and personal stories from my own life, with the hope that they transform your grief as they have transformed mine. Because even when it doesn't feel like it, we are planting the seeds of growth in the midst of great pain and heartache. Your grief is welcome here. Hi there, grief growers, and welcome to our first inaugural episode of Grief Seeds Live. After doing some reflecting over the break, I decided, long story short, that I miss speaking with you and interacting with you. So, this is the first of many episodes to come where I'll share something I know for sure about grief and loss, whether something I learned with a client or something that came up for me in my own life, or a helpful tip that I read about in a book or a story, or maybe one that I wrote about myself. And I'll come here and I'll share them with you. First off, this is my first time on this platform. So if you're watching Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, let me know if you can hear me. Because I'd love to know that I'm heard on these platforms and that you're getting the message loud and clear. And also let me know where you're calling in from. Today, we're going to be talking about practicing vulnerability. And this is something that I think a lot of people butt up against in the aftermath of loss, including myself, because grief does this thing sometimes where we cease to trust other people with our pain. We don't know how that's possible anymore, especially when our pain has been mishandled or um, poorly received by people in the past. And I worked with a client once a few years ago now who was really um, just very intent on, Shelby, I care so much about being vulnerable in the world again, actually telling people what's going on with me, relaying these stories that I know are true in my own life and these emotions that I'm feeling and experiencing, but I have such a hard time trusting other people to be a safe space and a safe container for my pain. So, the first thing I want to come on and say today is that's a really valid thing to wrestle with in the aftermath of loss, is not feeling like other people are a safe center or container for your pain. We're not taught societally what to do with pain, much less loss, much less devastation, much less things that are sudden and traumatic. There's kind of a thing that happens, especially in Eurocentric culture, where it's like respond, pay attention, and then move on to the next thing. Grief, loss, tragedy, the hardness of it all tend to be things that get swept up in the waves of living, whereas the people who have experienced them and faced them are continuing to live inside of them. And sometimes we have to reach out to people and remind them that we're still in pain, that we are still experiencing some sort of um, great loss, especially when people check in on us. How are you? What's going on for you in your world right now? What's the latest status update? So, this is a tool that you can use in life after loss at will, however you'd like to use it. Um, it sounds like Gigi will be joining us here soon. So, everybody say hello to Gigi as he probably walks all over me here in a bit. And this is something I worked on with one of my clients. She said, "I want to be vulnerable. I miss being that person. I hate going into the world and feeling so guarded with regard to my pain, with regard to my story. I feel like nobody knows that I'm suffering because I'm afraid to tell them. Because historically, in the past, when I've told people about my pain, when I've told people what's going on with me, it's not gone well. My pain has been dismissed or discarded or attempted to be prettied up. Some sort of, yeah, some sort of, it wasn't allowed to be pain anymore. That's essentially what happened. It was no longer allowed to be pain. So, in our session together, we devised this exercise that she could use to practice being vulnerable in the presence of other people. And one of the most guard inducing questions, I don't know if this is true for you and your loss, so please respond in the comments if this is true for you, is how are you? When you ask somebody who's grieving, and this is true for me as well, "How are you?" It's almost like I'm getting so many pieces of data and information all at once that it's like short circuiting. I don't know how to feel. I don't know actually what to tell you because while I'm getting all of these responses to how are you, I'm terrible. I'm exhausted. I'm still grieving. I am not well. I am uh going off the deep end. I am feeling deeply nostalgic today. I'm actually doing okay and I'm kind of afraid of that and what that means for me in my life in the midst of all of these pieces of information arriving to you inside of your brain, you're also receiving these bits of information when somebody asks, "How are you?" of how do I mitigate their response? What do I need to say to let you know that when you ask me, "How are you?" I can handle it. I can handle the pain of my emotions. I just want to share them with you. You ask me a question, I want to give you an honest answer. Um, and there's this grand swirling of, "Here's all the emotions I'm feeling right now. Here's the responses to 'How are you?'" And then here's me trying to manage or control or mitigate how the other person's going to respond. Well, if I respond this way, then they're gonna try to tell me to see a therapist. If I respond this way, they're gonna tell me I'm too sad. If I respond this way, they're gonna tell me that God never gives me anything I can't handle. So there are so many ways that people respond toxically to grief, and we try and do all of this pain management and mitigation when responding to something like, "How are you?" So I challenged this client that I was working with to respond honestly to this question for a week. "How are you?" with three people a day. Does not have to be everyone you meet, because not everybody you meet is deserving of your grief story, and that's another episode of Grief Seeds we're talking about. Not everybody's deserving of hearing your grief story. Not everybody is a safe container for that, and you can know that for sure. But what happens as you're testing the waters again of can I trust people with my pain? Can I trust people with my story? Asking, "How are you?" Answering, "How are you?" Truthfully, doesn't have to be long, doesn't have to be big. There's another episode of Grief Sage I did called 10 Responses to How Are You? You might like to go back and listen to that. But telling the truth of that and allowing it to sit there and then letting people do with it what they will, that is a practice almost I hear it in like monster truck voice. It's like extreme vulnerability. It's extreme vulnerability to answer how are you honestly and almost by sheer reality of you answering it honestly, making room for it in the world. Announcing your pain, even in a short answer of not great, is almost this sort of radical insistence that your pain be allowed to exist. And that's a very lovely thing in the aftermath of loss and something so rarely that we afford ourselves because society does not afford it to us by default. So there's something coming up for me here about in practicing being vulnerable, we are practicing with ourselves, allowing our pain to exist, but we are also asking others that our pain exist as well. We're asking others to allow that to be true in that moment. That's not what we're saying. We're not showing up to situations and saying, people ask us, "How are you?" And we're saying something like, "Can you allow my pain to exist?" But by answering honestly, by answering with vulnerability, we are requesting, demanding, insisting that our pain be allowed a space to show up in the world, that it be allowed to be true, that be allowed to be sit there, that is allowed to not have to go anywhere else to make other people comfortable. So I know that in asking how are you, there can be a lot of difficulties with that, especially right now when many cities, many parts of the world, many countries are still in some sort of lockdown. So, honestly, how many people are you going to see? So, receiving the question, "How are you?" may be a lot less common for you than it has been in years past because perhaps you're not going out in public as much as you used to do, if at all. Perhaps you're not interacting with people in the same ways that you used to. Perhaps you're in an entirely different community, or perhaps you're not part of a community at all. So, where do you get these opportunities to practice vulnerability if you are sitting at home alone? in some sort of isolation, in some sort of solitude. Where does that opportunity to practice vulnerability come in? And I think one of the first places you can practice vulnerability, and this is true for you too if you're not ready to do the "How are you" exercise yet. This can be true for you if if you sit with yourself in vulnerability. So you can do it in the morning. I'm a morning person. I like to do things like this in the morning. You can also do it at the end of the day as you're going to bed. You can ask yourself, "How are you?" and take a deep breath and answer very honestly, "How are you right now?" I'm feeling stuck. I'm feeling depleted. I'm feeling overwhelmed. I feel hopeless. I don't know what comes after this. I feel lost. I feel like I can't find my way out of this. I feel like I need to ask for help, but I don't know how. And that scares me. I feel like there's so many unanswered questions, and I'll never find answers or solutions to all of them. So, what's the point? Either journaling that out or even just saying that out loud with yourself. That's a way to practice vulnerability too. And what happens if you just let that pain, if you just let that statement of truth for you, not bad, not good, we're not putting any, not laying any judgment lenses over top of this. What happens if you let that be true? If you just let that be what it is. Um, Another way of doing this, because sometimes the question "How are you?" in and of itself is a tricky thing to answer. I wonder, try on the question, how is your soul? What's the state of your heart? If you could check in with the most core part of you, what would it say? These are other doorways to vulnerability that you can create for yourself. And there are even questions that you can ask your friends to ask you in the future. Because if "How are you?" is "I'm fine," if that's your default response, if that's what you gravitate towards or protect yourself with on a regular basis, which is extremely normal in life after loss to protect yourself with "I'm fine," the mask of fineness. Asking these questions among friends with people you already trust with your grief can be a wonderful and lovely way to practice vulnerability. I went to dinner last night with a very dear friend, and after we placed our drink orders and the server left, we took our masks off, and she looked at me and she said, "Shelby Forsythia, how is your soul?" And the disarmingness of this question, the instantaneous depth of it, the the request that I not approach from a brain level, "Here's what I'm doing, here's what I'm accomplishing." Even from a heart level, it's like, "Here's what I'm feeling." It's dropping down into the soul of who I am. What's going on in here right now? I'm gesturing to all of me. Um, what's going on in all of this, in and amongst all of this? And so I told her the truth that was real for me in that moment. And that's a beautiful thing too. This is a tool too that I've brought up in previous episodes, but sometimes "How are you?" is too big a question. It feels like you're offering a status update for this season of your life, which is too big. Too big of an ask, too much to offer up all at one time. And how can you really know with any sort of certainty what the answer to that is? So, how are you right now? How are you in this moment? As Sheryl Sandberg wrote about in Option B, she says, "How are you today?" is a more fitting and appropriate question than "How are you?" because it narrows down the required response timeline. Even though there wasn't one before, we're going to narrow it down. We're going to be very specific. Specificity is a griever's best friend. To "How are you today?" See how that changes your answers too. And then after you give the response, "I'm overwhelmed, I'm exhausted, I'm at the end of my rope, I don't know where to find answers, I think I need help, but I'm scared to ask. I'm feeling okay, but I'm actually terrified by that. I've experienced joy and I don't know what to do with it because it's so unfamiliar to me." Whatever answer comes up for you in the aftermath of loss, after you give that response, know that no more is required of you. You do not have to elaborate. You do not have to offer justification or details or supporting evidence or a timeline of events that has made you feel that way. That was your offering of vulnerability, and it was enough. That was it. That was all that was required of you. That was all you needed to say, all you needed to do, all you needed to be in that moment was that level of vulnerable. Just one answer. We're not asking you to root back into your childhood. We're not asking you to replay or relive your loss. We're not asking you to tell the story of why, how you got here. That's a very Eurocentric demand that we prove how we got from point A to point B to point C to point D. That's not the purpose of vulnerability, especially in life after loss. We are not here to prove ourselves or our pain worthy of being seen. By practicing vulnerability, we are simply insisting that it exist for that moment, and then no more is required of us. If you have the energy, you're certainly welcome to follow up. If they ask a question, you're more than welcome to respond. But you can also say, that's as much as I'm willing to share right now. And that's okay. That fits. It's it's perfect. And the goal of this, practicing vulnerability, in the short, practicing vulnerability, it can reconnect you to yourself, to your pain in ways that maybe don't hurt. It can build up this tolerance for truth telling in the aftermath of loss, saying it like it is without fear of driving yourself or others away. But on a larger scale, the practice of vulnerability is so much about rebuilding trust in a world that has broken your heart. Practicing vulnerability in life after loss is not just about insisting that your pain exists. Everybody show your pain everywhere all the time. Practicing vulnerability in life after loss is offering up these teeny tiny, like mini Lego sized building blocks that maybe this is a safe place, a safe world in which my pain and my grief and my loss and my heartache and my devastation and my uncertainty can all exist. Maybe I am truly welcome here. Maybe I never not belonged. Maybe I am a safe place for my vulnerability. Maybe others can be too. In a world, society, culture that demands pain be quarantined off, pain lives over here, the world lives over here. That's not where we live most of the time, is in a space of pain. It is a radical, down to the root, down to the core of what matters, practice and action to insist that pain be allowed to rejoin everything else. Because you want to know what? It's not you pulling that entire block of pain back to the world all by yourself. The pain is already there. You are just breaking the illusion that pain was ever separate from everything else in the first place. The last thing I want to leave you with before I take questions. So, if you have questions that you'd like me to answer today, especially about vulnerability in life after loss, I'd love to hear them. Um, is is talking about what to do when you are vulnerable and somebody does not receive it in a way that feels good to you. They do not create a safe container for it. They do not create a container at all. And you are left feeling raw and exposed and disheartened by the whole experience of it. What do you do? And yes, I'm seeing Nikki Lassiter May in the comments. Thank you. What if you get hurt after sharing your vulnerability? I feel very stressed when asked that because I feel like I should not share. This is a moment I very rarely mention the word gratitude in the grief space, so hang tight. I'm not gonna take you anywhere you don't wanna go. This is a moment where grief is offering you to look at this person and say, "Thank you for showing me where my grief is not welcome. Thank you for showing me that you are not a safe place for this. Thank you for showing me that it has nothing to do with how I have approached and what I have offered, but with your inability to be a container for and to hold presence with my pain." This very much relates to, I think it's episode 3 of Grief Seeds, Nikki Lassiter, if you wanna go back and listen, called Too Much. We live in a world that tells us we are too much with our grief. It's too big, it's too messy, it's too emotional, it's too overwhelming, it's too much of an inconvenience. Screw that. I don't wanna be a part of that. And yet, the flip side, the other side of the coin of too much, and I talk about this, I think it's in episode 3, so please go back and listen to that if you can find it in the podcast feed. Let me know if not, I'll send it to you. Um, is that the flip side of too much is not enough. And it's not that we as grieving people are not enough. It's not that we are incapable or we are broken or we are deficient or we are incapable in some way. It is that the spaces and the people we are trying to approach with our grief and our pain are not enough. They're not big enough. They're not grief educated enough. They're not compassionate enough. They're not holistic enough. They're not loss informed enough. On the best case scenario, maybe they're ignorant and they just don't know. On the worst case scenario, maybe they're malicious and pain has never belonged to them or in those spaces at all. Maybe the whole purpose of their existence or one of their missions is to insist that pain does not exist. And so then you get to decide. Thank you, grief, for helping bring me to this decision point. You get to decide whether or not you want to exist in these spaces and with these people when you are ready to share your pain and vulnerability. Do I want to live in a world or associate with people who insist that it does not exist, or insist that it's dumb, or too much, or insignificant, or too repetitive, or too overwhelming, or too complicated, or too messy, or too vulnerable, or too much? And this requires another kind of grief. This calls in another kind of grief, the grief of graduation from a world, a friendship, a relationship, a working partnership in which you are okay with or comfortable with sitting with those two contrasting things. I have pain, pain does not exist. And graduating to a place where, in order to access me, I'm putting like protective, I talk with my hands a lot. In order to access me, your baseline, your foundation must be to acknowledge at some level, whether by word or by action, that we live in a world where pain exists, where uncertainty exists, where messiness exists, where overwhelm exists, where anything can happen at any time. And we feel and face and cope with the fallout of that. That's for you to decide. And the permission slip I can give you in this right now today, you don't have to decide it all today. I've worked with folks in my online course called Life After Loss Academy. Somebody was with us in the cohort for the full 12 weeks of the program, from the first lesson, the first week of lessons, to the end, the last week of lessons. We watched as she transitioned herself gradually out of a workplace she'd been in for months, years, after back to back to back to back to back losses, into she thrust herself into some uncertainty. I am leaving this job. Management does not understand what it's like to grieve, and especially to grieve at work, which is another conversation we can certainly have. Um, I am leaving this space which is not welcoming of my grief in favor of the unknown, which at least acknowledges that pain exists. And by the end of our 12 weeks, by the end of our time together, she is like, I'm in a space working for less pay, but oh my God, am I surrounded by this tiny team of women who all know the pain of grief, loss of a child, loss of a spouse, loss of a sibling. And they formed in this, like, kind of amazing superhero networking kind of way, this little team of, "We know that pain exists, and we're infusing our workplace with this." The permission that grief can give you, or the doorway that grief can offer you when people are not okay with your vulnerability, is, "This is your exit. I'm being called off stage. This is no longer a place I'm willing to perform. My talents are not welcome here. They are not appreciated here. My gifts and everything I bring to the table, all of who I am, is not welcome in this space." And so, this is the part where the giant hook of grief calls us off stage and says, "There are other venues, there are other communities, there are other homes in which your grief, your pain is welcome." Thank you for that question, Nikki. That was really long. And you don't have to do it all today. This can be a gradual process of, "I'm noticing that these members of my family are not a safe place for my pain. What sort of exit strategy or what sort of boundaries can I build so that I can exit these partnerships or go low contact or no contact as needed so that I can surround myself with people and spaces that are more welcoming of grief?" Um, yes. Yeah, and you're right, Nikki, too, that I feel like people ask you that question, "How are you?" but they really don't wanna know how it is. Part of this is societal and linguistic. I would love to know who invented "How are you?" as a greeting or adopted it as a greeting as opposed to a actual inquiry, because those are 2 different things. "How are you?" Fine. So if you're passing somebody in the hallway, maybe not the time to be vulnerable. But if somebody's genuinely sitting down for a conversation with you or starts a phone call that you know is going to go on for a while with "How are you?" maybe a bit more of an opportunity to practice vulnerability. And this is something that we can talk about on a different call or a different episode of Grief Seeds. But I've also done this, and there's a blog post about it over on my Medium account called "How to Perfect Your Grief Story." There are tiers, TIERS, not TEARS, tiers of people to whom you can practice sharing your vulnerability and your grief. Everybody from your closest friends and family members all the way to, like, customer service lines that you call from, like, the cable company or the internet folks or your gas bill or what have you. So, some of my greatest, vulnerability interactions where I've been able to share my own story and then people have shared theirs with me is in the back of lifts, serving tables when I was a server in downtown Chicago. People ask, "How did you get to this place in your life?" or "What are you up to today?" "Oh, I'm going to this restaurant for my mom's death anniversary." There's a truth, there's a pain. I'm just gonna let that sit there. How will they receive that? "Oh, that's really interesting. I had a sibling die 6 months ago, and we're not sure what to do for his death anniversary that's coming up in May." And that opened mass talk about other doorways opening other than, "No, no, 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 pain is not allowed or welcome here." It was a totally different experience than some I'd had with friends or family or people I was in school with at the time. Yeah. As these doors close, and this is not abnormal to focus on in grief when these doors of vulnerability are closed to you because they become other things to grief. They become griefs on top of the grief, on top of the grief, on top of the grief. I see you in that. Sometimes we forget as grieving people because we're so overwhelmed with everything else. We're a little busy. When we're grieving, we're a tad bit busy. We forget to recognize that as we are grieving and there are massive amounts of doors that are slamming shut, we forget to remember that there are also doors that are opening. And this is not when God closes a door, he opens a window. This is not some divine thing is going to give you a blessing in the form of a new opportunity. This is the pits of despair, and we can talk about this on another one too. Tell you the story that you are trapped, that there is no place else to go, and there is no place in the world for your pain, for your grief, for your mourning, for your loved one, for you as a grieving person forever and ever and ever. Amen. When in reality, I know this from the work I do because, hello, this is a space where it is welcome. I know this from the clients I work with. I know this with the random Lyft drivers that I have these conversations with, is there are pockets of this world where pain is not only welcomed, but it is celebrated for the messenger and the love reminder and the grief honorer that it is. Getting chills as I say this. There are places where pain is celebrated not because it hurts, but because pain in and of itself reminds us of the preciousness of everything that we lost. There are communities where that happens. And so as you exit these spaces, these places, these people, these relationships that are not willing to accept your vulnerability, that don't love your response to how are you or ignore it altogether, there are also places and spaces in the world whose arms are already open to you and they are waiting for you to arrive. These spaces have been custom designed and tailored for you because the wonderful thing about grief that I remember so often in my own losses and so often when I'm in places of despair is that people have been grieving since humans have existed. And because people have been grieving since humans existed, they have also created rituals and spaces and communities and language and homes for grief to exist. So that's a tangentially related thing from grief. I'm going to pop over and see if we've got questions from anywhere else. Otherwise, I will sign off for the day. Any questions over on Instagram, all that jazz? Would be happy to hear from them. Yeah, this is a big one today. This topic, by the way, was chosen by our Patreon supporters. So this is the time where I can pop in and mention that if you'd like to support my work on Patreon, patreon.com/shelbyforsythia. Um, it's a wonderful space where I ask what you'd like to see next. Patreon is the space where I do behind the scenes of the book that I'm working on at the time. I'm working on my third book. It's also where people get to try on or beta test, if you will, all of my programs, all of my online courses before they come to the public for free. So these are people who get kind of I don't know if this phrase is appropriate, but they get grandfathered in because they're already supporting me in so many other ways that they get access to so much behind the scenes and creation process of the work I do. So if you'd like to support me there, patreon.com/shelbyforsythia, and you can help me choose the next topic for Grief Seeds Live. Bumping over to YouTube, Lori says, "Hi, it's nice to see you again." It's nice to see you as well, Lori. I've missed all of you. And Barb says, I ask if they want an on the surface answer or a deep down answer. This is a lovely thing to note with vulnerability and a great exercise that I think we can all take away from today, especially for you, Nikki. If being vulnerable is something that promotes a great deal of anxiety within you, you can ask when people are asking, "How are you? How are you doing? How's your soul?" Checking in with what color is your heart? What is the state of your heart right now? You can always ask, do you want a short answer? Or would you like the entirety of the answer? This is a really good kind of interim way to ask people in a way for permission or for consent before showing all your cards, before laying everything that you have about grief and vulnerability on the table. This is a phenomenal way to say, I have an answer for this. I'm willing to trust you with it. But I know sometimes people are short on time. I know people don't want to hear the whole answer. I know sometimes people aren't ready to talk about grief around the water cooler at work. I know sometimes people have places to be. I know sometimes talking about my grief can trigger other people's grief. So this is a phenomenal way, and thank you, Barb, for this on YouTube. This comment coming in is a phenomenal way to just kind of one step. Is this what you would like from me? I'm willing to practice vulnerability with you, but do you want something short? Do you want something brief? Do you want the surface answer? Or do you want me to go all the way? Because if I do, you're coming with me. There's a lovely song that I adore. I listened to it growing up by the Chicks. It's called If I Fall, You're Going Down With Me. And I think it's more about a woman who's dating a stupid man, and like, if you take me down, I'm gonna bring you down with me. But as it applies to grief conversations, it's like if you ask me for the deep answer, you are coming to the depths with me. This is a different way of asking, do you want to come along for this ride? Because I'll take you there. That's not what I'm afraid of. I'm afraid you won't come with me. Or once we get there, you'll tell me it's dumb. You'll tell me it's too much. You'll tell me I'm being ridiculous. You'll tell me God never gives me anything I can't handle. You'll tell me that time heals all. You can offer these stipulations as you go into practicing vulnerability with people to let them know these are my walls, these are my boundaries, these are my terms. And going back to Nikki, but going back to everybody who's on this call today, um, vulnerability, just like so many other things in life after loss, is a practice. So, every interaction you have with somebody in life after loss will teach you something about where these new walls and borders and boundaries lie. They will teach you what you need to know, what you need to put in place, what you need to have as a rule or a disclaimer or a consent form that people need to sign before coming along into the depth with you. You will start to piece together language of how to bring people into vulnerable spaces with you. And it sucks that we have to do this labor. I'm going to put that over everything. It sucks that this job or this obligation or this boundary setting falls to grievers to do. Society should know this. And this is part of the work that I'm doing and part of the work that I'm doing with other organizations in the grief spaces. How do we make people grief allies? How do we make them grief literate so we don't have to do all this work ourselves? But until that happens, the work remains in our laps. It remains for us to do. So, um, something that you can do is okay, for the first month to year after my loss, I'm just going to say, fine. I'm not even going to be vulnerable because I'm tired. I'm working on administrative paperwork. I'm doing death certificate stuff. I'm trying to take care of my family or myself or my health or my kids or my dogs or my house or my brain or my heart. I am doing something that's requiring so much of me that I do not have the energy to be vulnerable right now. But this client that I was working with, the story that I told at the beginning of the call, she was in this space where she's like, I have gotten myself and my grief. We have formed enough of a relationship, she and her grief, so that she felt relatively safe, relatively sound, taking it out into the world again. She's like, I'm ready to share. I'm ready to try being vulnerable again. I'm ready to trust that maybe some of the people I know, some of the communities I'm in, some of the buildings I enter are safe places for grief. Where do I begin? And so, this practicing vulnerability and how are you is a wonderful place to start. I'm going to take us through a blessing, a meditation, a benediction, whatever you'd like to call it, something that encompasses us in this space of doing grief work that we've done this morning. I'm going to ask you first, though, answer honestly in the comments if you're feeling vulnerable. This is a place where it belongs, one place you can start to practice this. How are you? Alternatively, what is the state of your heart? How is your soul today? If you'd like to let us know in the comments, I encourage you wherever you're listening or watching in from Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, um, give some folks some love, some upvotes, some responses, tag them by name. If they mention their loved ones, mention them too. And if you'd like to take a deep breath in with me here, we will begin our sign off for the day. My darling grief growers, may you know that your vulnerability and your ability to be vulnerable, to bear the contents of your heart in the presence of yourself and in the presence of others, is a precious object. It's okay to protect it, to guard it, to place walls, borders, and boundaries up around it. And grief is a world of paradoxes. It is also okay to share it. It is also okay to insist that your pain and your grief and your vulnerability be allowed to exist. It is okay. It is safe to show up as you are right now. May you know that when you receive backlash because of your vulnerability, when you receive ignorance, closed doors, platitudes, further pain and wounding, they are not measures, as much as they feel like it, of the validity and the truth of your loss and what you have faced, but signs and messages from grief and from your heart that these are no longer safe places to be. It's time to graduate. It's time to stand up, to look around, and to see what other doors, what other alternatives, what other people, what other spaces are open and waiting for you to arrive. It's okay to walk towards them. It's okay to seek them out. And when you arrive in these spaces, know that contrary to what you've experienced before, your vulnerability will be prized, it will be celebrated, it will be welcomed, and ultimately it will be safely held and witnessed in the company of others who are also grieving. May you know that even as it seems impossible or inaccessible now, that it exists, even if the only place where it does is right here, right now. Deep breath in here and out. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining me for this inaugural episode of Grief Seeds. I will be spending next weekend celebrating love with some very dear friends, so don't look for me next weekend. I will be back online, same time, same place, new topic on February 19th, right? That's also a Saturday. I hope so. Somebody let me know in the comments, but we'll talk about it. And if you are watching the replay, send me a DM, send me an email, send me a message. Did this resonate with you? And of course, I can always be reached at shelby@shelbyforsythia.com. I see you. I am so proud of you and the work that you're doing in the world. And I love you because even through grief, we are growing. I'll see you next time. So that's all for this episode of Grief Seeds. Thank you so much for joining me today. You can find additional grief support at shelbyforsythia.com or by following me on social media at shelbyforsythia on Facebook and Instagram. If this podcast helped you in your life after loss, please leave a review and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. And be sure to share Grief Seeds with a friend, because you never know what someone you love is going through. A huge thank you to my Patreon supporters for financially keeping this podcast on the air. If you'd like to support Grief Seeds on Patreon through a yearly or monthly pledge, you can do so at patreon.com/shelbyforsythia. My Patreon supporters receive behind-the-scenes access to everything I create, discounts on online courses and workshops, and priority vote on what grief topic I speak about next. Music for Grief Seeds is performed by Addie Goldstein. As always, my dear grief growers, it was beautiful sharing this space and time with you today. I see you. I am so proud of you and the work that you're doing in the world. And I love you. Because even through grief, we are growing. Grief is hard, but getting good grief support doesn't have to be. That's why I love text-based grief support from Grief Coach. For less than the price of an hour's therapy, Grief Coach sends you thoughtful tips and resources about life after loss all year long. Texts are curated by grief experts and authors and can be customized based on relationship, cause of death, and more. You also receive personalized texts for grief anniversaries and special days, and extra support around the holiday season. And if you have friends or family members who want to help you grieve but aren't sure how, you can add them to your subscription and Grief Coach will text them grief support tips and reminders of your important dates, because no one should ever have to grieve alone. Sign up for Grief Coach's text-based grief support today at grief.coach/shelbyforsythia. You can find a link in the show notes.